Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we are back with David, Arthur, and Mike to look at Operation Totalize. This is the sequel that nobody wanted to the Operation Spring show we did a couple of weeks ago, except we all wanted it. And which was underway 80 years ago today. Two phases with a long gap between the two, overly complicated, overly cautious. Why didn't the operation reach the town of Verrières? Well, these are the discussions we'll thrash out. We'll bring them all in now. Good afternoon, guys. I trust we're all well.
It's all great.
Hello.
Good. So we'll start like we did last time. We'll have Mike give us a bit of a kind of an overall situation of where we are in the early part of August. Then we'll turn to Arthur to kind of give us a German picture, and then David will give us the intelligence picture. So we'll start with Mike, and you've got your plan there, Mike. So what's going on the first week of August?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Woody. Very happy to be back here again. I think this is one of my my favorite pastimes to sit here and chat with David and Arthur and Woody, of course. And today we've got Totalize, and I guess I'll start by putting on my professional historian's cap and say that history is good, but unless you have context, you're going to run into a lot of trouble. So we're talking about Totalize today, but it's really important to remember that there's a whole lot of other things going on in Normandy at this point in the campaign. Of course, the last roundtable we had was on Operation Spring. That took place on the 25th of July. And at the same time was Operation Cobra, which was the big American breakout operation. It was slow starting on the 25th, got moving a little bit on the 26th, but by the 27th of July, the Americans had broken out and they were off to the races. On August 1st, Patton's Third Army was brought in, and you can see what Patton's doing with those big blue lines on the map that's on your screen right now. They made it to Verrières, cut off the peninsula there, and then broke out into to Brittany and made the big left hook towards Le Mans, and the Germans were in big trouble then. The British weren't inactive in this period as well. Operation Bluecoat was kicked off on the 30th of July. That was Montgomery's big British offensive that's going down south of Caumont. I actually have that orange arrow a little bit on the wrong axis there. It should be heading down towards Verrières. And it was a surprise for the Germans. And at the same time, the Germans are trying to figure out what to do with all this. And you would think that the rational choice would be to pull back. The Seine River is a natural break. It would make perfect sense to pull back, bring your forces out in good order, set up a new defensive line, and live to fight another day. But of course, Hitler maybe wasn't the most rational guy. His generals weren't able to control that. And so instead of retreating, he decided to attack. And the Allies were faced with Operation Luttich on the 6th of August, where there was sort of the remaining German panzer strength in Normandy was sent at Verrières, the idea being to cut off Patton's Third Army and trap them to the south away from their logistics base. But that didn't go so well. And I won't talk too much about that. I'll leave Arthur to take that. But this is what's taking place as the background to Operation Totalize, which kicked off late on the evening of the 7th of August and continued into the 8th. So I think that does a pretty decent job of giving us our context for today.
Great start, Mike. So Arthur will bring you in. So as Mike set you up there, the Germans should be doing something else, but they're not. They've got armor near Caen. They've got armor going off to Luttich. So what's the German situation 80 years ago today?
Hitler has decided that the obvious thing to do is to cut off the American spearhead of the Patton's army and reach the coast at Verrières, pushing with maximum force. But several factors are contributing to this plan never getting off the ground. Massive American defensive strength, air superiority from the United States and British and Canadian and other allied fighter squadrons as far as fighter bombers. And then there's the terrible problem of Operation Bluecoat, which has forced the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions to fight the British Army, which is pushing to support the American thrust. And of course, Patton is fully unleashed at this time, and he could turn, he's pushing east, but he could turn northeast and go into the German rear at any time. So Hitler he thinks he's obviously being brilliant and surrounded by his toadies within OKW, which is Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, and they're enabling this behavior. But of course, every German general within France is opting for the more sensible withdrawal to the scene, to take up a new defensive position there and to preserve the German army to fight another day, and to make the matters ultimately much more worse for the German, planning a massive Operation Totalize, and all these panzer divisions have disappeared to fight the British and to launch Operation Luttich, which is, comes down to basically the 1st SS Panzer Division and 2nd Army Panzer Division, which is not enough force to overcome the Americans and all the defensive force that is massed against the Germans. It's very much a lost cause, and it eventually contributes to the disaster of the Falaise Gap, which I won't go get ahead of myself here.
Yeah, brilliant start. So, David, we're going to bring you now for Ultra. And one of the things, I guess, by August is that the Allies have kind of got used to that information, that asset they have of understanding in advance, theoretically, what the Germans are doing. And clearly, the Allies are going to be doing something. Cobra has been successful. Blue Coat has been successful. The time now to capitalize on it. But Ultra, in a weird way, is kind of muddying the water because they think they've got a picture, but the picture they're getting from Ultra is not always tied up with what's going on the ground. So explain where what Ultra affects things at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a good way of putting it is everybody's hooked on Ultra by this time. And what, for better or for worse, this is what the defining hand is. We get that from Bill Williams, Montgomery's chief intelligence officer, who says, look, nothing is going to overturn Ultra except more Ultra. So basically, they're kind of digging their heels in on this. And what it's portraying is starting on the 4th, they're starting to see indications of those units along Verrières Ridge pulling out. As a matter of fact, on the 5th, they launch an attack on Mayne-sur-Orne. This is the second attack, and it's actually the Black Watch, who have just been rebuilt, are now thrown up the road to Mayne-sur-Orne because there are indications that the 1st SS have pulled out. But in reality, what they misinterpreted was that the 1st SS was in the process of pulling out. So there were still some rear guards in Mayne-sur-Orne, and the Black Watch lost another company just 2 weeks after being wiped out at Verrières. But what this was doing was they were unraveling the first indications of what turned out to be Luttich. In other words, the 1st and the 12th SS were moving back from Verrières into the Bretteville position, using that as a waypoint and moving over to Mortain. Now, almost everybody, and this is where it gets muddy, almost all the commanders had got the goods from Bletchley. In other words, my God, look what's going on. They're massing it in Mortain. And then there were 3 messages that came in, I think it was late on the 5th, early on the 6th, saying, this is what we're doing. We're trying to cut off the Americans coming out of Avranches. So it was quite clear what they were going to do, at least with the raw material. The problem was, of course, each headquarters would interpret it a little bit different. And the Patton's army realized that they could have a problem with their flank, and Patton really trusted Ultra. And so as a result, he ended up putting some of his, I think it was the 9th Air Force, on guard in that area, and some of his anti-tank units on the left flank to protect. Whereas Bradley and Dempsey were not really sure. They were going to be cautious because they didn't think that necessarily this was going to happen because it just didn't make sense. Well, it was the same thing at 1st Canadian Army. Even though at 1st Canadian Army, they were getting indications of this, it wasn't crystal clear. And we'll get into that later on why it wasn't. But they believed that this was not a sound operation of war. And therefore, if it was not a sound operation of war, i.e. pulling out everything on the front around Verrières, with the exception of 2 infantry divisions, and sending them over, that the Germans couldn't do it. That somehow the evidence that was being presented was wrong. Well, in hindsight, Peter Wright, who was the chief intelligence officer at 1st Canadian Army, wrote his mea culpa later on and basically said, look, the primary goal of intelligence is to say what the enemy is doing, not what they should be doing. And this was the bitter lesson that they learned on that day, because all indications were that Hitler's throwing the iron dice, that he's going for it, and that they are going to leave the Falaise road open, or relatively open. But of course, for various reasons, which we'll get into later, there's a series of misinterpretations for fascinating reasons coming out of Bletchley Park. But that basically gives it to you in the nutshell. So they knew what was happening. They realized that the road to Falaise was becoming not wide open, but at least more open than it had been for weeks leading up. So there was a golden opportunity here if they could get their act together quickly.
I'm muted. Thanks for that. And it's time to bring Caen in now because the British and the Canadians have been sitting around Caen now pretty much since June the 6th when they were just a few miles short of it. And there, you go through all Epsom and Charnwood and then Goodwood and Spring and Atlantic. And that road heading south from Caen via Falaise has been sitting there tantalizing everybody for weeks now. So regardless of what's happening over in Avranches, what's happening over with Patton there, something's going to have to happen in this area anyway. So we're getting into the stage now, these various incarnations of the Totalize plan, and we're going to have to bring in our players now of Simmons and others. So Mike, we'll turn it back to you again, and then all three of you. The first Totalize plan, as David said, there is being affected by the situation on the ground and intelligence report. But what's the basic aim of Totalize?
Yeah, it's a good question what the aim is. I mean, the stated aim is to get to Falaise, capture Falaise. Was that the actual goal, the realistic goal, or was that just something that if everything goes right, that's what we want to do? I would argue that really the point was to crash through Verrières Ridge and get on the road to Falaise. And it's really all about the definition in terms of looking at the success of the operation. Was it a success? Was it not a success? And in some ways, how you define what the ultimate objective was is key to that. So I'll leave that there, but we'll certainly come back to that. We'll remember in our last talk about Operation Spring that Verrières Ridge was the big problem, and you can see it on the screen there on the map on the left, the Fontenay-le-Marmion, Verrières, Tilly-la-Campagne. That's where the rock of the German defenses were. That's where Spring faltered and the Allies didn't get through that position. But you can see that Totalize is a much more ambitious plan. The first stage has them going all the way down to the Cramonil Spur. The second phase down through Saint-Aignan and Hautmenel, all the way down to Bretteville-le-Rabet. And then the third phase has them, I would argue, breaking out at that point, getting down onto point 195, and the Poles are going even further, just to the high ground north of Falaise. And you can see that in the dotted line at the bottom. So those were the staged 3 plans for the operation. It was all teed up with artillery and air support to get them there. And it was supposed to be a very clear delineation between phases 1, 2, and 3.
Brilliant. We'll bring Arthur in now, and I want to clarify what I said earlier. When I said they were sitting around Caen, I wasn't implying they weren't. There wasn't lots of fighting going on. Of course, there was this massive, great attritional effort going on, but they had been located around Caen for a long time, involved in some heavy combat. But Arthur, the fact is, as you said earlier, that the Germans have now split their force to some extent. They've ploughed some of the units off towards Avranches and Luttich, and this seemingly impregnable barrier they had south of Caen is now not as strong as it had been. So the Germans in that area south of Caen, what are they expecting is going to be happening in the next few days? Surely they must be aware the Allies are going to be mounting something. What's their intelligence like? What's their picture of what's going to be happening?
Oh, it's an incredibly poor intelligence picture, and they are absolutely fixated on the events to the west. They discover, of course, something's about to happen, a day before, but by that time, the Leibstandarte, the 1st SS Panzer Division, has already departed. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps is fighting the British in Operation Bluecoat, and what's left? Only the 12th SS Panzer Division as the armored reserve to support the defenses on Verrières and Bourgeois ridges. The infantry divisions have arrived, finally have arrived, and they're set up there. The 272nd, the 89th Infantry Division, which is just arrived from Norway, then it came to France, then it slowly came to Normandy. But a Canadian infantry division has close to 20,000 men. This German division only has 8,500, and it has the 7 infantry battalions. One of them is the Fusilier Battalion, but the Armored Reserve, now they are almost thinking about, it hasn't happened yet, but they're thinking about robbing even the last Armored Reserve, the 12th SS Panzer Division, which is reduced to a battle group now, to go west to fight the British and the Americans. And a terrible, also an event that is occurring, the British have gained a bridgehead at Grimbosk, which is just off the map to the left there, and a powerful battle group, what's left of the Tiger tanks, not the Tiger tanks, but the Panthers, and a few half-tracks have been detached there to fight the British at the Grimbosk bridgehead. So what's left is only a few Mark IV Panzer IV tanks, the Tiger tanks, maybe 10 of them, 10, 11 of them, a newly arrived Jagdpanzer company, and but it's in depth in the just south of the Syntho area, and they have to move it forward. But they're very confident, the Germans, in that. Oh, look how we handled spring. Absolutely no problem. We can defeat them again, and these fresh infantry battalions are now in place. And of course, is the German attention fixated south of Caen? No, it's not. It's very much fixated on Bluecoat, and all eyes are, of course, on Luttich and the target of Avalanches, and the massive logistical effort and movement effort of moving these panzer divisions, some of which have to move in broad daylight against the fighter bombers to fight the Americans in this desperate do-or-die move that the Fuhrer has insanely set forth, which will see the demise of the Panzerwaffe in France.
Brilliant stuff. I think it's time we bring in some of the leading players, some of whom came up in the spring show. So who wants to take us through the Canadians? Then we'll do the Germans, then we'll do the Poles. So why don't, Mike, you take us through the Canadian leaders?
Yeah, of course. So 2nd Canadian Corps is being led by Guy Granville Simmons, protege of Montgomery. You can see he sort of takes his styling from him. He's the guy standing on the left there with that's the 4th Division commander, whose name is escaping me right now.
Kitching,
thank you very much. Simmons is one of these guys that you either love him or hate him. He was a brilliant tactician. He knew what he was doing, but he was a commander rather than a leader. He did not win hearts and minds. He ordered you to do something, and you did it because you were told to, not because he was sort of leading the charge. But he was also an innovative thinker. He had a tactical mind. He looked at problems on the battlefield, looked at what had worked before, what had failed before, and tried to find new and innovative ways to make that happen. And I think Totalize in many ways was one of his most innovative battles, because he was trying to solve the deadlock on Verrières Ridge. We'd seen what had happened in Goodwood. We'd seen what happened in spring. And so Totalize was going over that same ground. So he knew that he had to do something different. So Totalize is a night assault, something that wasn't standard in the Allied armies. Allied tanks didn't fight at night. Yet here was Totalize kicking off at about 11 p.m. He was using armored personnel carriers for the first time. He had taken the priests, the M7s, taken the guns out of them, self-propelled guns, put some armor on and turned them into an ad hoc de facto armored personnel carrier to allow the troops to be carried over the battlefield in safety and protection from machine gun fire and shell fire, so that they could be discouraged on their objective and get to their objective in one piece. He was using means to keep the Allies going in the right direction, things like firing Bofors tracers over the heads of the troops, using searchlights, firing flares to help guide the troops, make sure they stayed in their lanes and had a sense of where they were going in the darkness. And did it all work? No, absolutely not. Battle is chaos. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. But he was thinking in a way that many of the Allied generals weren't at this point in the war, trying something new. And I mean, you have to look at Totalize, especially the first phase. It was a huge success, and a lot of that is a credit to Simmons.
Brilliant stuff. Arthur, let's look at the German side of things. And there's some kind of usual suspects involved from the 12th SS, but the same thing Mike did. Give us a kind of thumbnail sketch to who the Germans were in the situation.
Oh, the brand new 89th Infantry Division, who's, the commanders are not pictured here, but is fresh from Norway, but it didn't have any organic armor to it other than several of the Sturmpanzer IV, self-propelled 150 millimeter gun tanks, assault guns. But the real tanks were, of course, controlled by the Panzer Regiment commander for the Hitlerjugend. You see him there on the left, Max Wunsch, former adjutant to Hitler, Eastern Front veteran, but now very, very experienced. But the division that in the Panzer Regiment that he's commanding is very much a shambles. Of the 101 Panzer IVs, 37 or 39 are left. Of the 79 Panthers that are issued, only 9 are left at this point. They have these new arrival from the tank hunters, the Jagdpanzer IVs, but there's only roughly about 18 of them. And the division commander, Kurt Meyer, Oberfuhrer Kurt Meyer, he is operating 3 infantry battalions. There's one under Kraus. There's one under Obleiter, which has the half tracks, and there's one under Waldmüller. And they're so poor when it comes to infantry in the 12th SS Panzer Division, they've even begun employing the divisional headquarters escort company and the 1st SS Panzer Corps divisional escort company as well as frontline infantry. So he has a very much a reduced force to operate with, and it can only operate in a very confined area to be effective. The crown jewel of what they do have armored wise is controlled by Sphere SS Panzer Abteilung 101, which is the Tiger tanks, but there's only 11 of them left. The other Tiger tank battalions, they're to the west now, involved in fighting Operation Bluecoat. They'll come east later, but this is all he's got. So we're talking a maximum of 90 armored vehicles, maybe 10 to 15 anti-tank guns, a bunch of anti-aircraft guns, maybe 2 batteries, as well as the artillery regiment for the Hitlerjugend is somewhat complete. But they have great confidence that the 89th Infantry Division to the north of them on Verrières and Borgebus Ridge can at least fight to hold a little bit, and they do not anticipate the ferocity and the success that Totalize will be when the Allied tanks attack at night and surge through. And Wunsch, very much, he's being told what to do and ordered what to do. He has detached part of his force to fight the British Army at the Grimboss bridgehead, which is, at least, a 3 or 4 hour, involving heavy tanks march to get them set up back against the Canadians. So the Germans, they're in a hell of a situation where basically the Panzer Group West has been ripped apart. First SS Panzer Corps has been denuded of virtually all its powerful forces, and what's left is the shambles of the Hitlerjugend. They're very experienced.
Brilliant stuff. David, the Poles. Jenny Grant would come and lynch me if I didn't talk about the Poles here, and they're often a bit misunderstood because they kind of get treated separately, but they are part of things. I mean, again, thumbnail sketch of what they're doing and their role.
Yeah, I'm going to walk right into a trap here and get ripped apart for sure. But I did a lot of work years ago on the Battle of the Mace, and my impression walking away from the Polish Armored Division and studying them was that they weren't really a homogeneous unit. They were a collection of units that had escaped from Poland, and some of them came through Hungary and then through France and then up into Holland, and they were kind of jammed together. And there was a lot of infighting from what my understanding is from the men I interviewed who were within that division and from reading about that. And Maciek, I guess, their commander, I guess in some ways was more of an Eisenhower type in the sense that it was more about keeping people together as opposed to necessarily calling the shots. But even then, he had issues. There were some mavericks that were in the Polish Armored Division. And of course, even though they're thrown into the Canadian Army, they're really there, I would argue, for more administrative purposes and fighting within the corridor than necessarily part of the Canadian Army that had developed and trained over those years. So they're a bit of a wild card going in, and they're making their debut. And as Simmons was planning for this, the idea was to squeeze 2 armored divisions, the 4th and the Polish, all the way down to Falaise. And it's quite clear in the planning papers that they're willing to lose one if necessary. And it doesn't matter which one it is, that they're going to push on. And if they arrive with one intact at Falaise, that will be considered a success. So I think that gives you the kind of odds that the armor was up against and what they were expecting. But I should probably throw in here too that one of the things, and this may sound strange because of, taking the, I took the crap out of Simmons for spring, but I agree with Mike in this. He shows a remarkable amount of flexibility, but at the same time, he's also wed to his gunner upbringing and, of course, the fire plan, which is the doctrine of Canadian and British operations. And so when he designs Totalize, which in many cases looks at spring and says, yeah, no, we're not doing this again, and he does bring in changes, what he does is he creates 3 phases. And the first 2 phases are predicated on massive bombardment, not only by artillery, but by RAF Bomber Command, heavy bombers, and U.S. Air Force bombers. And the idea is to extend that artillery umbrella by other means. In other words, if your guns can't reach it, let's use the Air Force to be able to extend that umbrella, which makes perfect sense given the doctrine that you're using. But of course, what happens is, to tie back, he gets the Ultra that tells him that the 1st SS and the 12th SS have pulled out to Bretteville. He is under the mistaken impression that they're still in the Bretteville area, when in reality, they have taken off to the other side. One is 70 miles away, which is the 1st SS, and the 12th SS has actually come on to the other side of the Orne River. They would eventually scurry back, but they were on the other side. But because of that impression that he's under, the false impression, the misimpression, he actually thickens up, changes the plan, realizing there's going to be more of a fight in phase 2 around Bretteville. And that's where he brings in both the armored divisions. So his idea is that the armored divisions are going to hit the Bretteville line on the run just after the air power comes down and smashes everything in there. In theory, it sounds brilliant, but as we would know and find out later, that was not the case. In other words, the Bretteville line was essentially open. And as it unfolded, he paused. After phase 1, instead of pushing on, taking advantage of the fact that the road was wide open, he actually stopped and waited for the bombing to come in. Now, later on, his critics, including, believe it or not, Kurt Meyer, would liken this to a feeding pause during a cavalry charge. All right, which I think is a brilliant way of putting it. In other words, because the whole idea with him putting on the bombing was to maintain momentum. The idea was not to stop, reposition your artillery, and kill your momentum. The idea was, as the artillery is repositioning, you've got the heavy bombers coming down. So that was what he was trying to do. But in reality, it turned out to be the opposite on the day. So as much as he's flexible, as much as he's experimenting, and I give him full credit for that, it doesn't mean that everything comes off according to plan. And that's what we've got at this point.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to bring Mike in now because we're going to bring air power in. And, we talked about it in spring. By this point, early August, the Allies have a lot of stuff. They have a lot of goods to bring to the table: artillery, air power, fighter bombers, heavy bombers, Ultra, APCs, etc., etc., etc. So if he hadn't used that stuff, we would be sitting here 80 years on saying, why didn't he use this stuff? But he's now got to cram it all in, work it all in with these up. I'm Norma, in case you're getting angry at me, I'm just being devil's advocate now. I'm not saying that I support, I'm just setting out the stall here. But Mike, let's talk about the air plan, and then we can talk about the artillery plan, and then we can kind of carry on with the phases and things. But the air plan.
Yeah. Before I talk air power, I just wanted to make one point that for the Allies, there were sort of 2 types of divisions they had in Normandy. One were divisions that had been there for a while. I won't say they were tired out or exhausted, but they'd been through a lot of fighting. 3rd Canadian Division had landed on D-Day and had been through a lot of heavy fighting, heavy casualties. 51st Highland Division had landed on the 7th of June, same situation. 2nd Division came in later, but it had all those heavy battles south of Caen, and it was dealing with a lot of replacements and reinforcements. And then there was the 2 armored divisions, 1st Polish and 4th Canadian, that were brand new green divisions. They were new to the battle. They were, of course, well trained. They had great kit. They had keen, eager leaders, but this was their first battle. So you're going to have problems on both sides with units that have been there, done that, taken the casualties, and units that are sort of going through it for the first time. So none of that is an excuse or explains what's going on, but it's also something that needs to be taken into consideration. In terms of air power, the Germans didn't consider that there was going to be a major attack unless there were heavy bombers attached to it. That had been the case in Charnwood, in Cobra, at Bluecoat. Goodwood, there was no heavy bombers at Spring, which is a curious decision, but they were brought back for Operation Totalize. And using heavy bombers is a tricky tactical problem, because we're not talking precision bombers like we know about today. We're talking about a blunt instrument that has a lot of firepower to bring, but you have to be really careful where you drop it, because you're as likely to hit your own guys as you are to hit anybody else. And that's exactly what happened during Operation Cobra. Probably one of the worst examples, when on the 24th of July, the assault was called off. All the bombers didn't get it, and quite a number dropped short. And was it dozens, hundreds of American soldiers were killed in the short bombings, including General Leslie McNair, the senior U.S. general, killed during the Second World War. So bombers are good if they're well directed, but they can be problematic. So what Montgomery and Simmons was doing in Totalize was using them in 2 phases. The first were the night bombings by RAF Bomber Command. Bomber Command, I would argue, was more accurate than the U.S. 8th Air Force. That's something that we can talk about on another day. The U.S. bombers had the ability to be very accurate if they had perfect conditions, like when they're bombing over the desert in the southwest United States. But under actual combat conditions in Western Europe, they were on average less accurate than the British, who had become very proficient at night bombing, had aids like H2S and oboe and other things that let them see the targets at night. So they were the natural choice to use for the first night bombing. Simmons wasn't using them in front of their troops. They were using them on the flanks. And the circles around Metz-sur-Orne and Fontenay-le-Marmion were 2 of the main targets. But essentially, they were using the heavy bombers to screen the attack. That's a better. You can see those bombing areas on the edges. The heavy circles are where the planned bomb plots were supposed to be. The dashed lines are where the bombs actually ended up falling. Crerar, the commander of 1st Canadian Army, was very pleased with how the bombing had went, probably most because none of his troops were hit or killed. The bombs didn't come in areas that inflicted casualties on the Allied troops. But that being said, they didn't always hit the exact targets that were indicated. Mayne and Fontenay were supposed to be absolutely flattened in the bombings. That didn't happen, so there was some pretty heavy fighting that still had to take place. But the bombing went well. Now, the second phase, as we talked about, was supposed to pause for the U.S. Air Force coming in to bomb around, I think, 11 o'clock daylight on the 8th of August. Now, there, things didn't go quite as well. Part of the problem is marking. Somehow wires got crossed, and the colors that the ground troops were using to say, hey, this is us, don't hit us, were the same color as the flares being dropped by the bombers saying, here's our target, hit it, which was part of the problem. But the Americans, I don't know, like you can see the Americans were bombing targets all the way back in Caen. How they can't look out their windows and say, hey, here's a big city, this is what we want to hit. Well, no, it's some 7, 8, 9 kilometers behind the front line. And there were heavy casualties in 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 1st Polish Armored Division that were hit by those short bombings. Yeah, Simmons always has somebody else to blame, Brad. I'm not sure we can blame Crerar for that. I would tend to put that on the heads of the master bombers and the U.S. aircraft, that somehow they mistakenly bombed short. And the problem with the American system is that each plane doesn't individually target, drop its bombs individually targeted. They look for the master bomber who, once he releases his bombs, then all of the planes in the box, 12 aircraft in total, drop their bombs. So it just takes one guy to get things wrong for 12 aircraft to drop their bombs wrong. And I think that's what's happening there. Again, we probably didn't need this pause at this point. The main breakthrough had taken place. The Germans had been disorganized. What the pause did was give them more of a chance to regroup and recover. The American bombing, certainly it had an impact on them, but it wasn't decisive, and it was probably more of a negative at this point in the battle. But I see where Simmons and Crerar and Montgomery are thinking the more big booms you have on the battlefield, the better it is. Spend ammunition, not lives. Makes sense. As it all worked out, it wasn't the best decision in this case.
Brilliant stuff. I want to bring Arthur in now. Someone's got to do the artillery, and I'll mention a couple of comments that came in from Sheldrake. So the artillery plan, again, lots and lots of tubes, lots and lots of shells. I'll let Arthur explain it, but particularly from the point of view of what effect it had on the Germans. But I want to just bring in what Sheldrake said. He said a couple of things, in fact. He's talking about the arrival of the German division. He said the arrival of the 89th allowed the Germans to reoccupy positions that had been abandoned by 1st SS between Spring and Totalize due to casualties. And he then says, I always find it odd that the Duke commanders are criticized for using the artillery, which was one arm in which they clearly surpassed the Germans in quality and quantity. So it kind of comes back to what I was saying a minute or two ago, is that the Allies have this stuff. They're not going to go in not using it. It's a question of how to use it. So Arthur and or David, the artillery plan.
Yes, it's everything. They're going to do both a creeping barrage, moving forward with the line of explosions from the medium and field regiments, as well as time concentrations on specific areas. And of course, when it comes to field artillery or medium artillery versus air attack with heavy bombers, the artillery fire is much more accurate, and it can be much more powerful over the long term, and it's 24/7. You can do it. It doesn't matter if it's dark or light. You can just keep on firing, and you can adjust it. You can do all sorts of things. But with the advantage with the heavy bombers, it's massive firepower almost instantaneously in a very short period of time, almost catastrophic, apocalyptic. But the field artillery is, yes. And of course, excellent point there. The counter battery, they can effectively suppress all gun positions of the 89th Infantry Division, what's left of the 272nd Divisional Artillery. And the Hitlerjugend artillery is, as David mentioned, to the southwest there, which they have to move all the way up. So you see why on the 8th of August, only part of the Hitlerjugend can come into action, because they have to move the whole darn thing in daylight, up. And of course, they have to have their command conferences and everything. And at the same time, of course, there's no shortage of shells. So the medium regiments and the field regiments, all the new 25-pounders, all the M7s that are still in action, as well as the medium regiments with the 4.5 and 5.5-inch guns, are all blazing away continuously. This endless apocalypse to suppress and destroy the positions of the 89th Infantry Division. Of course, they're going to attack. Simmons loves attacking on a small, concentrated front with maximum effort, and that's what he's going to do with maximum firepower.
Brilliant stuff. I want to bring David in now, talk about combined arms, because we had a comment a little bit earlier in the sidebar. I'll find it for us there. The thing is, the Allies were still learning combined arms warfare on the job, and they were deployed on actual campaign by trial hit and miss methods. So, it's a perennial subject on the channel, is the Allies kind of and the 2 steps forward, 1 step back they kind of do with learning. They learn stuff in North Africa and the Med and Sicily, Italy, and then they kind of forget some of it and have to relearn it again. Things are absolutely getting better by August, but it's not the finished product yet, is it?
Yeah, exactly. It's still a hard school, and they're still learning as they go. And, you know, one could argue that going at night is also complicating the issue too, because now you're dealing with darkness as well. But the other thing too is, remember, you're trying to do a combined arms approach, which then maybe gets you away, if you will, out of the gunner-dominated methodical attack into a more cavalry mentality, if you will. In other words, this is going to break open very quick because of the methodical approach, and then we have to exploit. And so I don't think at this particular time, particularly the Canadian Army, was not ready for that, to absorb that. And that is certainly something that comes out in the files, where I've seen criticism about Crerar and the way he shapes 1st Canadian Army, to the point where everything was like what they call a toot, a tactical exercise without troops, where all the processes had to be followed 1 step after a time, as opposed to saying, hey, there's the enemy, go get them. It would be like, wait a second, what does chapter 2 say? What does chapter 3 say? And let's follow this. So there is this paradox where they're creating a plan that is demanding that combined arms, where you move from the methodical into the exploitation. But they really haven't built, in my opinion, the kind of infrastructure yet, or at least it hasn't developed to the point where you can absolutely take advantage in this kind of situation.
Brilliant stuff. There's a few questions in the sidebar about air power and the US Army Air Force, both kind of saying that we're being too critical, but also why aren't they learning? So we're getting kind of balanced views there. But, you know, we'll just address that right now before we move on. So Peter O'Connor saying, realize the US Army Air Force hated the idea of using strategic bombers in a tactical air support role. You'd think Cobra bombing mishaps might have better informed Totalize planners. So Mike, you know, maybe we came across a bit negative. We're also being a bit negative about the Canadian armor and the Polish. We're kind of being a bit negative about everyone, although we are saying that success. Is it, where would you say the US Army Air Force is in terms of using heavy bombers generally? Is it too broad a question to ask, because there are some things they're doing well and some, is this just a case of it not, is this against the run of play, or is this have they still not perfected it?
Yeah, no, it's a really easy answer to that question. Air Force officers hated doing close support. Doesn't matter if you are talking heavy bombers or fighter bombers, they hated doing close support, partly because, especially for the strategic bombers, they thought their main goal was to be a war-winning function, and that meant going after Germany. That meant going after oil targets and transportation targets and things that would bring the German economy to its knees. It was an irritant, a distraction to be able to do close support bombings of the type that the Army wanted. The second factor is that the Air Forces weren't good at doing close support. Typhoons weren't good at it. Spitfires weren't good at it. The heavy bombers weren't good at it, mainly because of 2 factors. One was accuracy, which we've talked about. And again, that goes with the Typhoons and the Spitfires and the Thunderbolts and Mustangs as well. But also they had a really hard time finding their targets on the battlefield. The kind of things that the Army wanted them to attack, field guns, troop concentrations, strong points, are incredibly difficult for fighters and bombers to find on the battlefield. And even if they can find them, it's even more difficult to hit them and be effective at them. So yeah, the Air Force hated doing a close support because they weren't good at it, and they thought it was not what they should be doing. That being said, in Normandy, they were ordered to do it. Harris was a reluctant ally of Crerar. When Crerar sent Harris, I'm talking Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris here, when Crerar sent a note back to Harris saying, thank you, your bombers did a great job last night, Harris basically said, anytime, come talk to me the next time you need support. So whether that's politicking or he actually believed that, I can't say. But yeah, we could do an entire show on the idea of the Air Force.
Well, we should. Let's summarize what went well about the first part, the phase 1. There's the British element, there's the Canadian element, the Polish element. Then we can deal with Arthur, the German counterattacks, then we can kind of morph into the phase 2 and what happens. Then we can kind of move into the aftermath, and it will be moving back and forth during the timeline a little bit, I suppose, in this. But Arthur, do you want to do the British attack, and then we'll have perhaps David do the Canadian attack? Does that make sense?
Sure, sounds good. So the British attack, well, yes. Well, they Ken Tout, with his A Fine Night for Tanks, off they go in the middle of the night. And something I have to say here, one of the myths of Totalize is it's a big shambles and the armored night attack doesn't go well, and tanks, squadrons disappear and troops disappear and, things crash into each other. But I also have to give Brian Reed's book. This, I believe, is the definitive book on Totalize, No Holding Back.
Yeah, good book.
And these maps are done by the masterful Christopher Johnson, who we're using today, so I have to give him his props. But the tanks columns move out, and they're tremendously successful in that they move through at night. And of course, there's no Waffen SS Panzers driving around in the middle of the night to potentially have some kind of, I don't know what, tank versus tank battle in the midst of darkness or some kind of dust storm. And the best the Germans can do is occasionally fire an anti-tank gun at these massive columns as they're cruising through between the German positions at night. And then something that I always thought about Totalize is it's almost like this. You guys will find this funny, but it's a pinball game. And the balls going down towards the pinball table are the armored brigades and the infantry battalions, and the pins are the villages, but it's a tremendously confined area on each side of the Route Nationale 158. But the British and the Canadians make a tremendous, they do it perfectly, I believe, bouncing between these villages around them to drop off the infantry where they're supposed to be. And they conduct their assaults at night. The Germans resist for a point in time until they discover that, man, we've been surrounded, we've been bypassed, there's no escape, and they begin to surrender, these grenadier battalions, and the ones that don't surrender move to escape in a very rapid manner. About 50% of the 89th Infantry Division is destroyed, its fighting element, but this, the armored columns are tremendously successful. It's an absolutely brilliant move by Simmons, and with the defrocked priests, they which half have been allocated to the British, half to the Canadians, it works perfectly. So the losses of Goodwood, the losses of Spring are negated, all forgotten, and it's sunshine and lollipops, and they achieve phase 1 objectives to a tremendous degree.
Brilliant stuff. And Mike, we'll have you talk about the Canadian aspect, but already I'm seeing the fact that we're looking at 2 maps side by side that are showing east and west of the N158 highway, and that's not even showing what the Poles are doing or situations elsewhere. There are a lot of moving parts. The timing is inevitably going to go all over the place with these separate advances south. So before you explain the Canadian situation, was the plan, was wriggle room for timings built into the plan, or was there a set schedule it had to adhere to? Mike, you're muted.
Yeah, of course there was time built into the schedule to allow for the unexpected, but it was fairly rigid. They hoped to have the first phase completed by first light on the 8th. As it took probably until 12 o'clock noon the next day until sort of all those first phase objectives were captured. But then we also see that Simmons and Montgomery are sort of making it up on the go. And what was originally supposed to be a 3-phase attack, after they looked at the success of phase 1, they combined phases 2 and 3, and just decided to go for it. And well, that's a story for another day, Friday, in fact. But the first phase was chaotic. I mean, it was a night attack, and the troops really hadn't trained for that. They hadn't prepared for that. Their doctrine didn't support that kind of a movement, so they were all kind of making it up as they go. Darkness is one problem, but then you also have smoke and dust from the artillery and the heavy bombing. there was a heavy mist on the ground as well, just because of the time of year. So it meant that these vehicles, tanks, flails, flamethrowers, the defrock priests were having a really tough time keeping their way, even though they had all those supports in terms of searchlights and anti-aircraft guns and stuff like that. So the plan was for the spearhead columns to head as far south as they could, down to Rocancourt and the Cromenil Spur, basically bypassing any opposition, and that would all get cleaned up by follow-on troops. But the spearheads were supposed to get through, capture their objectives, and sort of dig in for the next phase. That more or less happened, but there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of the battalions got misdirected. They got lost. They all eventually got there, but it wasn't a straight line, and it wasn't as if it was a map table exercise. So Simmons was right in this case. It didn't quite go as he planned it, but it did go, and it did get done, and it was all pretty impressive by the time it was all over.
Brilliant. Arthur, I want to bring in the Germans now, because, you know, from the Allied point of view, we're separating this battlefield into phase 1 and phase 2, but obviously the Germans don't know that. They're just seeing an unrelenting tide of armored vehicles and infantry moving towards them. So when everything starts happening on both sides of the road, there's British advancing, there's Canadians advancing, what do the Germans do?
The Germans see a huge apocalyptic bombing raid, this thunderous artillery barrage and artillery concentrations on all targets on Bourgebus and Verrières Ridge, and they there's no other way to say it. They do not know what's happening, and they don't know what's happening until roughly about 8 o'clock in the morning, when a staff car, you know, rushes forward and sees the tanks of the 33rd Armored Brigade and the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade sitting there in their ambush positions next to, very close to Saint-Aignan, Gossamil and Robertsmill. And these two armored brigades, they've achieved their objectives, and they're just sitting there. And of course, the Germans that are isolated are attempting minor counterattacks, but a lot of them are withdrawing or trying to fight their way out through this massive confusion. But you see the beginning of these infantry battles. Some of them take all day long to subdue the German strongholds on Verrières Ridge and Bourgebus Ridges, to beat down the Germans, and completely clear the areas. And this clearing process, and of course, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division Commander Charles Folks has been threatened with losing his job, and he is obsessed, absolutely fixated with clearing each and every stronghold of Germans for Simmons, to say, Simmons says, excellent, Charles, you're doing a wonderful job. But there's two key tasks that these two attacking divisions, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and 51st British Highland Division, have to do. And that is to facilitate the travel of the Polish Armored Division and the 4th Canadian Armored Division through, so they can continue the advance. And this mixed up fighting that sometimes goes on all day in places like Tilly-la-Campagne and Mayne, it mixes up and stops and impairs that. And so the 4th Canadian Armored Brigade, as well as the Polish Division armored elements, have a terrible time getting through. But of course, there's no real urgency, because of course the second bombing run is coming in, and there's no do or die, you must get through. But at the same time, this confused fighting with the Germans that continue to fight up until noon and into the afternoon in some places before they escape or surrender, it takes up critical time. And this is time that Kurt Meyer needs. And of course, Heinrich Eberbach, the Panzer Group West commander, as well as Fritz Kramer, they're breathing down his neck to react to this massive breakthrough, what they see as a breakthrough. And of course, Kurt Meyer, very dramatically, of course, he makes up, his post-war memoirs that, is the most dramatic thing ever, that he goes forth and sees these two masses of what he believes are two armored divisions. They're actually two armored brigades just sitting there. And this huge breakthrough has occurred. But in reality, in behind those tanks, there's massive infantry battles going on both the British side of the highway and the Canadian side of the highway. And this fracas is badly interrupting and delaying Hitchin moving forward, as well as Manchak moving forward with the Polish Armored Division. But at the same time, the Polish finally get there, but it's into the afternoon, and the 4th Canadian Armored Division into the afternoon. So that's what does the 89th Infantry Division achieve? I guess that's that delay. But there you go.
So, David, I mean, we talked about in the spring show, we've talked about all the time. We know the Germans are going to counterattack. The Germans are always going to do that to some extent. It's a question of what size it's going to be. But that is, I mean, that's kind of built into the plan, isn't it? But going back to Ultra again, and the fact there's, Luttich is falling apart, has already fallen apart. The units are limping back from that. Does Ultra now muddy the water again? Would it have been better off now not receiving updates from Ultra? Should they have just been concentrating what's happening in front of them? What's going on at this point now in terms of updates intelligence-wise?
Okay, well, here's the thing. I've hinted at it a couple of times, and what was happening was Ultra, if you will, was so successful in Normandy when it came to the code breakers and the volume of traffic that they were able to intercept and they were able to decode and decipher. Now, all of that then had to be sent to the front. And of course, there were special liaison units there to handle it, and special communication units, which would actually take it. And the special liaison units would bring it to the commanders and the intelligence officers and show them, here it is. Now, the problem was that multiplied something like threefold since D-Day. So they're getting thousands and thousands and thousands of messages, and they're deciphering them. And it is beyond their wildest imagination of how successful they are. But there's a problem. You now have to get that stuff down to the commanders in the field, but your wireless apparatus or your wireless infrastructure can only handle so much at a time. So Bletchley, in conjunction with 21st Army Group, Montgomery, make a decision that they're going to start stovepiping Ultra to the armies. So basically what they were doing before was they were sending information about what was happening across every single army front to every single army. Now they were only sending information to the army and its direct front, or at least when it came to the Canadians. And so as a result, and this is what I mentioned earlier, was the messages were coming in that the 1st and the 12th SS were pulling out. And they were also messages that were intercepted that pinpoint and confirm that they were facing the British and the American armies. The big problem was the Canadians never got the confirmation messages because they were no longer on their front. So it left a false impression that they were still there, because the Canadians never received the follow-up message to say, no, they've arrived and we've confirmed that they're on the first US front or the British front. So as a result now, everything that unfolds, whether it be the pause, waiting for the second bombing, is essentially done because Simmons and Creer are still wed to the fact that this is what is about to happen, that they're either in position at Bretteville or they're going to come in en masse to counterattack. So this is one of the big problems. And here I am, after taking it to Simmons, I'm getting Simmons off the hook here, because there was a lot of criticism about Simmons for many, many years about not pushing this, etc. But 21st Army Group never followed up, as far as we could see, by telling them that no, the other two were on the other side until late in the day. So it gave that false impression, and that is the impression that they're working under at this time. So that's what they're waiting for, and that explains why they were so wed to that pause. And of course, we could probably open it up to a counterfactual. What if they had the right intelligence? What if they knew, without a doubt, that that road to Falaise was open? Would they have pressed it?
Well, we'll talk about that in a few minutes' time. Sheldrake in the viewers saying phase 1 was very successful. The South Sac attacks down the ridge to seize Fontenay and assist at the Mayne were very successful too. We know that now. What was every commander in the field, kind of at battalion level, were they aware that phase 1 had been a roaring success, or was there still a bit of confusion on the ground? Because as Arthur was saying, there are these kind of infantry elements of Germans. There's little bits of counterattacks and withdrawals. what's the situation at when we say that phase 1 has been completed? Are all the people on the ground aware of that success? Mike, let's bring you back in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, by the end of phase 1, they were down south of, well, what's the line? Cromenel, Calouet, Saint-Aignan to Cromenel. They had broken through Verrières Ridge. They had achieved the objective that had been sought from Goodwood through Spring, and now they've done it. They've smashed that main German line of resistance, and they weren't in the clear, but they had certainly knocked one of the big pegs down off the wall. So now the road was open-ish in front of them, but there was still a lot of hard fighting to do. But they certainly knew they had accomplished phase 1.
So we're into the gap. We're into this delay between phase 1 and phase 2. So do we want to recap why there was a delay? What was spoke? You talked about the bombing plan, but what was the time schedule supposed to be, and what was the wriggle room? What should have happened? Let's just kind of bring that one in there. Arthur, do you want to bring in first, and then we'll go back to David again?
Sure. So this. In the 4th Canadian Armored Division and the 4th Canadian Armored Brigade, as well as the Polish armored units, there is a mad panic, not a panic, but a continuous pressure on them, heavy pressure on the radio. Just move forward, move forward, move forward. And I hope we can have time here to discuss Leslie Booth, who had a very, very challenging time. He had a hell of a time, continually ordering, driving forward the British Columbia Regiment, driving forward the Canadian Grenadier Guards, driving forward the Governor General's Foot Guards, which there he is. And he just spends the whole day virtually from sun up right till about 4 o'clock when the bad incident happens, which we'll get to hopefully if you want me to discuss it. He's fighting his 3 armored regiments to push them forward and fight them through. But the 2nd Canadian Armored Division, as well as the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade in some places, is still conducting these firefights with tracer and tank fire and artillery fire going on everywhere. And these units are having caught in tremendous traffic jams to push their way forward. But Leslie Booth, the very combat capable, experienced armored brigade commander brought in especially from Italy, is having a hell of a time. And then at 4 o'clock, 1600 hours, he just goes silent on the net, and Kitchen is desperately trying to get him. And eventually, that time, sometime in the evening, he gets forward, and of course, some minor combat with the 4th Canadian Armored Brigade has occurred, but they've sort of somewhat shut down things for the evening, and they're going to reset to attack, almost at midnight for the 9th of August assault. But Kitchen approaches his command tank, and there's nobody in there, and he just looks down into the tank. There's nobody in the turret, and he sees at the bottom of the tank ring this body, and it's Booth. And he's there's no other way to say it. He's dead drunk. And this is at a critical time of the Totalize assault. And he's, Kitchen manages to get him awake, drags him out of the tank, not, physically dragged, but gets him out. Then it's the people around have to depart about 30 feet because the screaming and the yelling goes on for about 5 or 6 minutes straight. And Booth is finally, kicked into action. But this tremendous failure, we don't know why exactly it occurred, the strain of combat, and we'll never know. He's killed during Tractable, but he had a hell of a time getting his armored brigade forward. And now, now as the evening has gone on and combat is still going on, there's the decision to wait and rejig and to lead the assault with both the Governor General's Foot Guards as well as the BCRs on the 9th of August. But there's some very hurried planning, some of it in darkness, some of it, in very difficult situations.
Thank you for that, Arthur. So let's go back to the gap between phase 1 and phase 2. And Mike, we talked about the bombing plan earlier on, and obviously bringing over any size, whether it's fighter bombers, medium bombers, heavy bombers, you can't just call it up and it arrive 2 minutes later. It's not like artillery that's a few miles behind the front. This is going to be coming from bases, miles away. So, what could have been? Should we start kind of? Are we going into counterfactuals right now? I mean, the delay between the phases obviously causes the issue there. I mean, Mike, what? Just expand on this delay and what your thoughts about it, basically, whether it includes counterfactuals or just give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I before I do that, I'm been reading, keeping an eye on the chat, and it warms my heart to see all the discussion of air power and close air support in there. And
there's some amazing stuff going on this side.
Yeah, no, I think that's all fantastic, and it's such a big story, and I think there's so much yet to be understood about that, and we can come back to that another day. Chaos kind of reigns on the 8th of August. 1st Polish and 4th Canadian Armored Division have to get up to the start line, up to the front, which means they have to go through the battlefield. It means they have to go through all of the units of 51st Highland and 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. They have to go through an active battlefield. They stay out of the fights for the most part, but it's a slow slog. And if you read the war diaries, the BCRs and the Algonquins are the two that I'm most familiar with. They just talk about the endless hours of waiting, sitting in their tanks, sitting in their half tracks, stuck in traffic jams, waiting to move forward. So it's a really long day. I mean, that's one reason for the delay. We talked about how sort of confined to the plan this operation is, and that bombing attack by the U.S. Army Air Forces is a key part. You can't send your troops forward until that happens. It's on a set timing, so regardless of whether you want to go forward at that point, you can't until that's happened. And then there's some dislocation caused by that bombing. There's no units hit at the front, but it is known that they've been hit behind, and that's causing confusion. It's causing a lot of radio traffic, which is sort of causing problems on the airwaves, able to get messages through and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of reasons, and there's Germans there. We can never forget that the Germans are part of this equation and have something to say about how this plan is going to go, and how smoothly it's going to be. And the Germans are still fighting. They're still throwing in counterattacks. They're not giving up. They're not moving away. So yeah, it's a standard battle. It's the kind of thing that nothing ever goes to plan, and you just have to sort of roll with the punches.
Thank you, and we'll bring Arthur again now, because the maps that you provided from the Totalize book, they kind of break it down. So the German counterattack on the 8th there, where the person that we've deliberately not mentioned yet and will not be mentioning gets killed, and then there's the other map of the withdrawal, but it's not quite as neat as that. As you were saying earlier, there are bits of withdrawals while counterattacks are happening, and there are bits of counterattacks while withdrawals are happening. But kind of summarize, I think you already have a little bit, but kind of remind us what the situation was for the Germans kind of overnight into the 9th of June. And then we can bring back to David again, and we can talk gradually kind of bring it to the kind of the failure of the second phase. But give us a rundown of where the Germans are.
Yeah, so the first Kampfgruppe to arrive, Waldmüller, he's the closest, which is the 1st Battalion of the SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment 25. And he moves forward. He's close to Meyer, who's also with Eberbach, the Panzer Group West commander. So we have all these key commanders moving right up to the front to actually look at the Canadian tanks and the British tanks. And the sharp words are exchanged and orders are given. Obviously, Eberbach pushes the orders right down Meyer's throat that he has to stop this with any means possible as soon as he can. And so what's available right away to him is Kampfgruppe Waldmüller, this reinforced infantry battalion, the Tiger tanks, as well as the Mark IVs. And there's stragglers from the 89th Infantry Division and the Fusilier Battalion. They're ready to move in. Sorry, I'll just close this window here. The animals have decided they can open windows. They're smart enough. And yes, and the key armored commander who's going to supposedly deal the stopping blow is, of course, the acting commander of Schwer SS Panzer Abteilung 101, of course, Michael Whitman, the tank ace, but he is I have to make this point here. Well, he's a very talented tank commander. There's, one of 15, 16 Tiger tank commanders that are just as good within the course of the war. Then they conduct this attack, but this is all of the division, all of the Hitler he can mass. And then at the same time, just as they're forming up for it, the U.S. bomber massive airstrike goes forward, and the German grenadiers, they look to the sky, and very dramatically, one of the machine gunners said they sent a B-17 for each one of us, which is very, very close to the truth. It's actually not far off, because there's so many B-17s and there's so little Germans that as way as infantry, but the infantry of the Germans of Waldmüller have to follow against the Panzers. So the Panzer IVs attack the British, and the Tiger tanks attack the Canadians and the British on each side of the highway, and they move forward. And there's a problem, though. The 33rd Armored Brigade, as well as the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, are set up in excellent defensive positions, ambush positions. There's an estate with a walled compound, which the Sherbrooke Fusiliers have punched holes in the walls, and they're set up defensively as best as they possibly can be. Michael Whitman, I'll relay the story here. He advances rather in proper wedge formation. He advances in column, 2 by 2, sort of in column. And I believe he thinks that the Canadians are farther north than they actually are, the British. And he's not ready. And of course, the fire comes in from all sides. They lose, I think it's 5 or 6 Tigers of the 10. 3 or 4 of them manage to pull back. The battle is more successful for the Panzer IVs against the British. They managed to destroy a few more British tanks, but the Panzer IVs also take tremendous losses. Waldmüller's grenadiers, they pull back, but they feel that, oh my gosh, we've accomplished something. We've stopped the armored spearheads. But what they don't understand is the 2 armored spearheads of both the British and the Canadians have halted in those positions and are very much in a defensive stance rather than a ready to charge through stance, because the 4th Armored Brigade, as well as the Polish armored units, have not reached there yet. They're waiting for this massive U.S. airstrike to cruise through. And at the same time, the very little in the way of armored or artillery fire can get directed on the Canadians and British. But luckily for the Germans, the United States Army Air Force comes to the rescue and blasts one box of B-17s, detaches itself and blasts the Canadians, the Army Group Royal Artillery, as well as some aspects of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, badly wounding Major General Rodney Killer in the process, and disrupting some supply units, as well as a massive ammunition dump that gets destroyed. This is very, very unfortunate. It's a very tragic friendly fire incident, but it's more than the Germans could ever hope for or accomplish. And the Germans look on this event when they see the bombers actually bombing the south of Caen. They're appalled. They don't know actually what's happening, as well as the Canadians and the British who are watching this event. I didn't mean to get into Mike's area here. Sorry about that, Mike.
No worries. So let's kind of we're going to wrap things up because Mike has to go in a few minutes, and so does David. So the Germans withdraw, and let's kind of get that assessment of where we are. You said yourself, David, Kurt Meyer himself said kind of the road was open to Falaise. Was it open to Falaise? What would have happened if they pushed on down the road? I mean, it would have to have been followed up by a version of tractable anyway to really capitalize. Let's kind of start to kind of round it all up. Phase 2 doesn't go as well, David. What's your assessment?
No, I think what I love about doing a show like this, and we get a chance to pose the counterfactual at the end, is the standard interpretation in the historiography is essentially Totalize has been that white elephant. In other words, it did have some success by getting Verrières Ridge, but somehow there was that chance for so much more. And of course, that's sort of where we're left with at this day and age. And I think that's the fun part with the counterfactual, because you can present certain aspects and then we can discuss it. But, even though I've kicked open the door, if you will, to that discussion when it comes to that door being wide open and wow, they should have known it. And if they hadn't been, would they have done it? I think Mike hits it right on the head. I think regardless of how open that door was, I think the traffic was so bad that they hadn't, they never really dealt with anything of this scale to the point where they would not have been able to disentangle that mess to take advantage of it, even if they thought they could. And I think that's one of the big things right now. But again, I think this will be a fun debate that will continue going forward in the historiography. Was it a white elephant or not?
Well, let's bring Mike in, and then we'll have Arthur. So, again, we were saying earlier about there's all these little villages, all have got to be taken out, secured, occupied. Artillery is going to be brought forward, etc. Mortars, all the logistics, all the rear support. So, Mike, your assessment. Do you agree with David? Do you have something else to say on this point? You're muted. Hang on, you're muted.
Oh,
here we go.
Sorry. I think my point is, I agree with David. I agree with all of it. I think the part that I really want to rail against is allowing Kurt Meyer to define this battle for the Canadians and the British. His comment that if only they'd pressed harder, if only they'd kept going, they could have really changed the nature of the battle in Normandy. And I don't think that's the way we look at it. I think you can look at it as a glass half empty, which is Meyer's comment. I would look at it as a glass half full. We bust through the Verrières Ridge. We destroyed the main German line of resistance there and advanced farther in Normandy than we had at that point to date. I think it's a stunning success what they accomplished. We can't look at what could have been or what they should have done or how they could have moved forward. I think we have to look at what they did do, and in the context of the previous battles in that area, this was a stunning success. And I know we'll talk about Worthington Force on Friday, and that in some ways I kind of detach that from Totalize. I kind of think it's a sort of a sub story on its own, not really part of Totalize, sort of set on its own. But we'll talk about that and what the sort of the costs and opportunities were there. But no, for me, Totalize is a big success story.
And the other thing that we need to acknowledge is it does blood the Polish Armour Division. It bloods the Canadian units that have not yet seen action. They all get some experience out of this. They all can move forward with that first match under their first bed notch on, but not on the bedpost. So and the attritional aspect. Every time we deal with these advances against the Germans, and we'll bring in Arthur now, the Germans lose people, material, armored vehicles they cannot replace. Whereas, except for the human life, which of course is always tragic, the Allies can replace the things to most extent that they're losing there. So Arthur, Meyer is being typically like a lot of these Nazis, his hubris and pride and trying to make pull a victory out of a defeat. But where are the Germans by the end of the 9th and 10th of June? Where are the Germans in terms of losses and morale and locations?
Oh, we're talking about maybe 10 to 15 Panzer IVs, maybe two or three Tigers operational, maybe 5 to 6 Panthers. The Jagdpanzer unit, the Jagdpanzer IV that has arrived, is the most successful against the Polish and inflicts very, very heavy losses on the Poles. But these are just scraps and remnants, and a lot of the heavy bombings, the aerial attacks, have attrited the Germans down to nothing. So the 12th SS Panzer Division, or what's left of it, does execute a brilliant defensive battle on the 9th of August. They can't stop the Canadians going to a point close to Hill 140. They can't stop the infantry attack of the Argyll and Southern Highlanders onto point 195 because there just isn't enough of them, and they're waiting desperately for the 85th Infantry Division, which is another one of these weak infantry divisions, to race up and help the what's left of the Hitlerjugend to effect some kind of defense. But the what's left of the Hitlerjugend is overwhelmed or intractable and manages to escape. There is a myth of the total destruction of the division in the next 2 or 3 weeks. The losses for the 20,000 men of the original division in Normandy run to about 8,000 to 9,000. So a lot of the support troops, as well as the artillery regiment, as well as some infantry and panzer troops, managed to escape the Falaise battle. They're not knocked down to like 400 people. That's it's simply not true. But tremendous losses because all the combat arms elements within the division are badly attrited. But on the 9th and on the 10th, this strong point is created. If you show the map on the Quesnay Wood, I don't know if you have one for the Quesnay Wood, where they pack what panzers they have in, and Simmons continues to attack on this very narrow frontage. So Wundt and Meyer managed to accomplish what they can, but they're each side of the Quesnay Woods is Canadian and Polish strong points, and they do manage to defend this wood, but they use it almost as a choke point against further advances, which slows down and eventually forces, I believe, Simmons to consider Totalize to have shot its bolt and to rebuild this planning process and rejig everything for what becomes Operation Tractable and the final capture of Falaise. But the Hitlerjugend has, of course, been attrited down to nothing, and the counterattack of Meyer on the 8th of August, annihilates the panzer strength in, going right into the jaws of defeat, with the 33rd Armored Brigade and 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade in perfect ambush positions with all their fireflies blasting away.
And I think I want to bring up what we talked about on the spring show before we bring this to an end, is that I think in my head, I've always had Totalize as the beginning of the Falaise pocket battle, whereas we were saying last time that actually, no, it's the end of the kind of the securing of Caen battle. It's bringing to an end Spring and Atlantic and indeed Goodwood. And we shouldn't judge Totalize totally with all the knowledge of what we know happened now 2 weeks later, because that knowledge wasn't known then. They didn't know that Saint-Lémer-Sedive and the Mace and all that was going to happen. Obviously that they know there's going to be more battles later on, but it's important to judge this by the information that they had at the time about where the armies were now. So before we bring things to an end, any kind of closing point? Let's bring Mike in for a closing point because you have to go. Anything you didn't feel you said that you want to say?
No, I think we've done a good job covering the terrain here, so to speak. I think in terms of the development of the Falaise pocket, I don't think any of the Allies considered that was going to happen because they expected the Germans to act rationally, and they didn't. They were stupid, and it cost them.
Yeah, I think I'll jump on by saying that, the enemy gets a vote in all this. And I think, going back to the idea of whether this is the closing chapter of Verrières or the beginning of Falaise, well, kind of both, because we didn't know that Falaise was going to develop the way it did. I mean, it's opportunistic that this becomes the beginning of the Falaise pocket battle, but they can easily be seen, or it can easily be seen as both for sure.
And I think we said earlier, we can still see the Allied learning. We can see since the last time we spoke, things have got better, still not perfect since spring. They will get better again for Tractable. They will get better again, closing on the Seine River, better again as they push towards Germany. And the Germans, without going too much down a rabbit hole, they're still not really learning. They're just committing the same errors and doing this. So Arthur, your final summary before we bring this to an end.
Oh, no, this was Totalize was a tremendous success. And as far as British advances using British Army doctrine, which was how the Canadian Army fought, is a tremendous success. And we fought to our strengths. We stayed within range of the guns. Of course, the doctrine of the British Army and the Canadian Army, very much Royal Artillery, Royal Canadian Artillery dependent, as well as using, the doctrine of the British Army, not, I could advance, 50 kilometers in that way, and I'll just go that way. It's not how the British armored commanders or infantry commanders or, corps or battalion commanders fought or thought. They're very much directed in a very Simmons-centric, tight control. You will do this when I say to do it and have it done by what time I want you to say it. And when you've captured that objective, you are to dig in. And so, the British Army and the Canadian Army, were being very successful and fighting to how they were trained to fight and to succeed. And they were doing so.
Well, we'll leave it there. Folks, as always, it's been a delight talking to Mike, Arthur, and David. We're doing the same thing with a different panel tomorrow from Poland, talking about the Warsaw Uprising, which is also raging 80 years ago today. And then Mike is back on Friday to do the Worthington Force, which is part of this, and as we established, separate at the same time, in a kind of paradoxical way there. It's pertinent, but it's deserving of its own show. So I will see Mike on Friday. Arthur and David will do well. David, you'll be back on a First Allied Airborne Army panel in a couple of weeks' time. Arthur will have you back at some point talking about your next book. But right now, thank you very much for your brilliant contributions, folks. Thank you very much for your brilliant comments. I'll have to go back and read that sidebar. There's like a degree level of information just in the sidebar. You're all brilliant, Sheldrake, particularly Brad. Others, great contributions. But I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
See ya.
Bye. Bye.